The afternoon sun beat down on Beverly Hills with a blinding, almost sterile California glare, baking the flawless asphalt of the silent streets. Here, in this hyper-exclusive gated community, perfection was not an aspiration, but a baseline requirement. Every lawn was a manicured carpet of impossible emerald, every mansion a monument to unimaginable wealth, guarded by ornate iron gates that whispered of detachment. The air itself seemed different, thinner, scented with a curated blend of jasmine, chlorine from hidden pools, and the faint metallic tang of money. It was a world of opulent tranquility, a hermetically sealed bubble where the harsh realities of life were kept at bay by high walls and higher bank accounts. The only sound that dared to break the unnatural hush was the rhythmic hiss of automated sprinklers, a metronome counting out the slow, empty hours of another perfect day in paradise. Perched on the marble terrace of her sprawling modern estate, Victoria Sterling embodied the very essence of this world. Dressed in a silk Chanel sundress that likely cost more than a public servant's monthly salary, she held a champagne flute with an air of practiced nonchalance. Her beauty was striking, but as immaculate and artificial as her surroundings, her expression a carefully maintained mask of bored amusement. Below her, on the pristine street, Officer David Miller's standard-issue Ford Explorer patrol unit looked like a dingy relic from another universe. He had stepped out of his vehicle, his crisp but functional uniform a stark contrast to the world of couture and comfort around him. His attention was fixed on a gleaming, black Range Rover parked awkwardly near Victoria's property line, his brow furrowed in a way that suggested a deep professional focus, an earnestness that was utterly alien in this environment. Victoria let out a sharp, condescending laugh that cut through the quiet air. It was a sound designed to be heard, a performance for her two friends who lounged on plush outdoor sofas beside her. "Look, girls," she announced, her voice dripping with disdain as she gestured dismissively with her flute. "Officer Friendly thinks he's a detective." She paused for effect, a smirk playing on her perfectly glossed lips. "What's he going to do? Arrest a Range Rover for being too clean?" The comment was met with a chorus of delicate, cruel laughter, the sound of privileged women reinforcing their own superiority by belittling a man they saw as little more than a part of the scenery, a uniformed fixture in their perfect world. The joke was not just about him, but about his entire existence, so far beneath their own. Down on the street, the mocking laughter reached Officer Miller with perfect clarity. For a fleeting, unguarded moment, his shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly, and a flash of deep, personal hurt crossed his weary face, the sting of being seen not as a person, but as a caricature. But just as quickly, the hurt was gone, replaced by a steely resolve that hardened his jaw and narrowed his observant eyes. He did not grant them the satisfaction of a glance. Instead, he turned his back to the terrace, deliberately and methodically pulling out his handheld device. The public humiliation, intended to diminish him, had the opposite effect. It solidified his instinct, transforming a professional hunch into a personal mission. He was determined to trust his gut, to do his job with the integrity they found so amusing, and prove that substance mattered more than their shallow perceptions. Before we see what Officer Miller discovers, subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we dive deeper into a story of unexpected connections. Officer Miller's focus remained unwavering as he input the vehicle identification number into his system. The mockery from the terrace was a distant, irritating buzz, easily tuned out by years of training to concentrate amidst chaos. His fingers moved with practiced efficiency over the screen of his onboard computer, each tap precise and deliberate. He was not looking for validation or applause. He was simply following a thread of intuition, a subtle alarm bell that had rung in his head the moment he saw the slightly incorrect font on the license plate. It was the kind of detail most people would miss, the kind of detail that separated a routine patrol from a significant discovery. In his world, instincts were a critical tool, and his were telling him that this pristine, expensive vehicle was a ghost. The confirmation came back in under a minute, not with a simple message, but with a flashing red banner that seized the entire screen. The VIN was flagged, linked to a vehicle reported stolen in Arizona 3 months prior. The license plate belonged to an identical model, a legitimate car currently parked in its owner's garage in San Francisco. This was a cloned vehicle, a sophisticated deception used by high-level theft rings to move stolen assets across state lines undetected. The system pinged with alerts, notifying regional task forces. Miller felt a cold surge of adrenaline, the professional satisfaction of a hunch paying off, immediately followed by the weight of the situation. This was no longer just a suspicious vehicle. It was the key to a major criminal operation. Without a second glance towards Victoria's mansion, he keyed his radio, his voice calm and measured, betraying none of the internal excitement. He reported the hit, requesting backup and the presence of detectives from the auto theft task force. He methodically secured the scene, placing evidence cones and beginning the tedious but crucial process of logging every detail. On the terrace, the mood had shifted from derisive amusement to mild annoyance. The arrival of 2 more patrol cars, their lights flashing silently, was an unwelcome intrusion into their serene afternoon. Victoria's friends complained about the noise and the spectacle, their primary concern being how the disruption would affect the ambience of their gathering. For them, it was still just a bit of over-the-top drama. But then the unmarked sedans arrived, followed by a local news van, its satellite dish already extending towards the sky. The scale of the response made it clear this was no minor infraction. Detectives in sharp suits now conferred with Officer Miller, who pointed towards the SUV, speaking with an authority that Victoria had never imagined he possessed. It was in that moment, watching him treated as a valuable professional by other serious-looking men, that the first true crack appeared in her bubble of privilege. Her world, which she believed to be impenetrable and secure, had been breached. The owner of that cloned car had been a guest at her brunch, mingling, laughing, and drinking her champagne less than an hour ago. The news broke quickly, spreading through the rarefied air of Beverly Hills like a virus. Major interstate car theft ring uncovered in Beverly Hills, the headlines would later scream. Victoria watched, frozen, as a reporter began a live broadcast from her curb. Her perfectly manicured lawn was now a backdrop for a major crime scene. The laughter of her friends died in their throats, replaced by a stunned silence. Their insulated reality had been violently punctured, proving that their gates and guards were no match for the ugliness of the outside world. The incident was no longer a joke, no longer a source of entertainment. It was a violation, a chilling reminder of their vulnerability. For Victoria, the shock was compounded by a rising tide of shame that burned in her chest. Her mocking words, "Officer Friendly thinks he's a detective," echoed in her mind, each syllable a testament to her own ignorance and arrogance. She had ridiculed the very man who was actively protecting her world, a man who saw a threat she was completely blind to. The emptiness she so often felt was now filled with a new, corrosive emotion, guilt. She saw the scene not just as a crime, but as a personal indictment of her character, of the hollow values she had so casually displayed. Her disdain had been proven to be the foolishness of a sheltered child. She retreated inside her vast, silent home, the cold marble floors offering no comfort. She ignored the incessant buzzing of her phone, knowing it was her friends, eager to dissect the drama, to turn the violation into a piece of exciting gossip. But Victoria felt no desire to talk. She felt a profound need to be alone, to grapple with the uncomfortable truth the incident had revealed about herself. The mansion, usually a symbol of her status and success, now felt like a cage of her own making, its luxurious rooms filled with the echoes of her own shallow laughter. The sterile perfection of her life had been exposed as a fragile illusion. In the quiet of her study, surrounded by priceless art and first-edition books she had never read, her thoughts drifted to her father. He was a titan of the tech industry, a man who built an empire from code and ambition. He had taught her that worth was measured in stock prices, market share, and public perception. He saw people as assets or liabilities, tools to be used or obstacles to be removed. Emotions were inefficiencies. Service, charity, duty, these were quaint concepts for those who lacked the drive to conquer. Victoria realized, with a sickening lurch, that she was his perfect product, wealthy, powerful, and utterly devoid of purpose. She had inherited his fortune, but also his emotional poverty. Driven by a strange new impulse, she opened her laptop and typed Officer David Miller, Beverly Hills Police Department, into the search bar. She expected to find something, anything, a commendation, a complaint, a news article. But the search yielded almost nothing. There was no social media presence, no heroic headline, no dark secrets. There were only public records, his years of service, his clean record, his modest salary. He was, by all digital accounts, an ordinary man living an ordinary life of service. This lack of a grand narrative was deeply confusing to her. In her world, everyone curated a brand. Miller simply existed, and his existence had just had a more meaningful impact than her entire life to date. An overwhelming compulsion to apologize took root inside her. It was an alien feeling. In her life, apologies were strategic maneuvers, admissions of weakness used to manage public relations. This, however, was different. It was a raw, personal need to correct a moral failing. She wanted to stand before Officer Miller and take back her words, to acknowledge his value and her own deficiency. The idea was terrifying. It meant admitting she was wrong, not just about him, but about everything. It meant making herself vulnerable to a man she had treated as less than human. The thought made her hands tremble, yet the alternative, doing nothing, felt unbearable. The next afternoon, she found herself driving her Aston Martin to the Beverly Hills police station. The building was a jarring contrast to her usual environment. It was a functional, unadorned structure of concrete and glass, built for purpose, not for aesthetics. The air inside smelled of stale coffee, industrial cleaning supplies, and the faint, anxious scent of humanity. It was a place of consequence, a world away from her life of curated leisure. She felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if she had crossed an invisible border into a foreign country. Her designer clothes felt garish and out of place under the harsh fluorescent lighting. At the front desk, her usual confidence failed her. When she asked to see Officer Miller, the desk sergeant, a stern-faced woman who looked thoroughly unimpressed by her, barely glanced up. "He's on duty. You can't see him unless you're filing a report," the woman stated flatly. Victoria tried to leverage her name, a tactic that had always worked before. "It's Victoria Sterling. It's about the incident yesterday." The sergeant cut her off. "He's writing the report on that incident right now. He can't be disturbed." For the first time in recent memory, Victoria felt powerless. Her name, her money, her status, they meant nothing here. Here, procedure and duty were the only currencies that mattered. Frustrated and feeling foolish, she retreated to her car, which was parked conspicuously amongst the more humble vehicles in the lot. She waited for nearly 2 hours, the leather seats of her luxury car feeling more like a prison than a comfort. She watched officers come and go, observing their easy camaraderie, the way they carried the weight of their responsibilities in their posture. Finally, she saw him. Officer Miller walked out of the station, his shift clearly over. He looked exhausted, the lines on his face deeper than she remembered. He carried his duty belt in one hand, and his shoulders were slumped with a weariness that was bone deep. Gathering a courage she didn't know she possessed, she got out of her car and approached him, her heart pounding in her chest. Her first attempt was clumsy, her voice sounding small and uncertain. "Officer Miller?" He stopped, turning to face her. There was no recognition in his eyes at first, just the tired gaze of a man who wanted to go home. Then, as he placed her face, his expression shifted. The weariness was replaced by a guarded, professional mask. He knew exactly who she was. The memory of her mocking laughter hung in the air between them, an invisible but solid wall. "Miss Sterling," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. It wasn't accusatory, but it was cold, creating an immediate distance. He stood with a posture that was both patient and dismissive, waiting for her to state her business, so he could leave. The power dynamic had been completely inverted. On her terrace, she was the queen, and he was the jester. Here, in the shadow of the station, she felt like a child seeking absolution from a stern and unapproachable authority figure. All the witty, charming lines she usually employed in conversation deserted her, leaving her feeling exposed and inadequate. She had rehearsed an apology in her mind, a perfectly crafted statement of regret. But faced with his stoic presence, the words felt hollow and insincere. I wanted to apologize, she stammered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue, for my behavior yesterday on the terrace. It was inappropriate. She looked at him, searching for any sign of forgiveness, any softening in his expression. But his face remained a neutral mask, his eyes revealing nothing. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with her unspoken shame and his unspoken judgment. She felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to retreat back to the comfort of her superficial world. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "It's forgotten, Miss Sterling," he said, the words clipped and professional. "I was just doing my job. Now, if you'll excuse me, it's been a long day." He made a move to walk past her, clearly intending to end the conversation. His dismissal, though polite, was more cutting than any angry retort would have been. It communicated that she was so insignificant to his world that even her cruelty was not worth remembering. It was a professional courtesy, not genuine forgiveness, and it left her feeling even more ashamed than before. But something inside her, a new and stubborn sprout of integrity, refused to let it go. "No," she said, her voice stronger this time, stopping him in his tracks. "It wasn't fine, and it shouldn't be forgotten." He turned back to her, and for the first time, a flicker of surprise registered in his eyes. "What I said, it wasn't just inappropriate, it was cruel and ignorant. And I am truly sorry." She met his gaze directly, letting him see the genuine remorse in her eyes. The polished mask of the socialite had finally cracked, revealing the uncertain, guilt-ridden person beneath. He stood there for a long moment, studying her face. He was a man trained to read people, to look for tells, to separate truth from deception. He saw past the expensive clothes and the perfect hair to the raw vulnerability she was showing him. It was a stark contrast to the arrogant heiress from the day before. He seemed to be reassessing her, recalibrating his opinion. The wall of professional detachment between them began to show the faintest of cracks. He was no longer just dealing with Miss Sterling. He was dealing with a person who was clearly in distress. "Why are you really here, Miss Sterling?" he asked, his tone softer now, laced with genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. The question disarmed her. She had expected anger or dismissal, not a sincere inquiry into her motives. The truth tumbled out before she could stop it. "Because I was ashamed," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "You were doing something important, something real, and I treated you like you were nothing. And it made me realize that maybe I'm the one who is nothing." The admission hung in the air, a raw and painful confession of her own existential emptiness. His expression softened further. He seemed to understand that this was about more than just a careless insult. He gave a weary sigh and ran a hand over his face. "My job. It's not glamorous, Miss Sterling. 99% of it is paperwork, dealing with trivial complaints, and seeing people on the worst day of their lives. Yesterday was the 1%. It doesn't happen often." He was, in his own way, humanizing his work for her, trying to bridge the vast gap between their realities. He was showing her a glimpse of the man behind the uniform. Falling back on her old habits, her instincts conditioned by a lifetime of transactional relationships, she made a critical error. "I'd like to make a donation," she said, her voice regaining some of its business-like efficiency. "To the police department. A new training facility, better equipment, whatever you need." As a token of my gratitude, she saw it as a grand gesture of amends, a way to use her power for good. She expected him to be impressed, perhaps even grateful. Instead, a shadow crossed his face. The nascent connection between them instantly vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp anger that was far more intimidating than his earlier indifference. "My integrity isn't for sale, Miss Sterling," he said, his voice low and firm. "We don't need your guilt money. We need respect. We need people like you to see us as human beings, not as your personal security guards to be mocked or charity cases to be bought off. You can keep your donation." The rebuke was swift and absolute, leaving her stunned and deeply embarrassed. She felt her face flush with shame. He was right. She had tried to buy her way out of her guilt, to turn a moment of genuine human connection into a financial transaction. It was a deeply ingrained instinct, the only way she knew how to solve a problem. She had seen his service and immediately tried to put a price tag on it, proving that despite her apology, she still fundamentally did not understand his world. The chasm between them seemed wider than ever before. Her apology had been a failure. The conversation ended there. He gave her a final, disappointed look and walked away without another word, leaving her standing alone in the parking lot. She watched him get into a modest, decade-old sedan car that was probably worth less than the handbag she was carrying and drive off into the evening traffic. She returned to her empty mansion feeling worse than before. The encounter had not brought her absolution. It had only highlighted the depth of her own moral bankruptcy. The loneliness she felt was profound, a vast, echoing emptiness in the heart of her luxurious life. Meanwhile, David Miller drove home to his small, tidy apartment in a neighborhood miles away from the glamour of Beverly Hills. The encounter with Victoria Sterling replayed in his mind. He was still wary, still skeptical. Rich people, in his experience, were often bored and capricious, creating drama for their own amusement. Her apology could have been just another performance. Yet, he couldn't shake the image of her face when he had refused her money, the genuine shock and shame. There was a sincerity there that he hadn't expected. The woman was a puzzle, and despite himself, he was intrigued. Victoria spent the next few days in a state of deep self-reflection. The opulence of her home, which once provided a sense of security and status, now felt suffocating. The infinity pool, the home theater, the walk-in closets overflowing with designer clothes, it all seemed like a collection of meaningless trinkets. She felt an urgent need to connect with something real, something of substance. The world of champagne brunches and charity galas, the only world she had ever known, suddenly seemed like a shallow, pathetic farce. Her entire existence felt like a beautifully decorated but completely empty room. She made an attempt to talk to her friends, hoping to find some understanding, some validation for the profound shift she was experiencing. She met them for lunch at their usual spot, a chic restaurant with exorbitant prices. When she tried to explain her feelings of guilt and her newfound respect for Officer Miller, they stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "Victoria, you're being so dramatic," one of them said, waving a dismissive hand. "He's just a cop. It's his job. You don't need to have a whole existential crisis over it." The reaction was a cold, clarifying slap in the face. They didn't understand because they couldn't. They were still deeply embedded in the world of superficiality that she was so desperate to escape. They saw her crisis of conscience as a strange and embarrassing obsession. The conversation quickly shifted to gossip about a rival socialite and plans for an upcoming trip to Monaco. Victoria sat in silence, feeling more alienated and alone than ever before. She realized with chilling certainty that she had no real friends, only companions in her gilded cage. This painful realization solidified her isolation, but it also strengthened her resolve. If her own world couldn't offer her meaning, she would have to find it elsewhere. She began to research in earnest, not about David Miller the man, but about the life of a police officer. She read articles about the psychological toll of the job, the high rates of stress-related illness, the constant exposure to trauma and danger. She learned about the long hours, the relatively low pay, and the immense personal sacrifices that were required. For the first time, she began to comprehend the true nature of a life dedicated to service. In his modest apartment, David Miller unwound from another long shift. The commendation he had received for the car theft bust sat on his kitchen counter, a simple certificate in a cheap frame. There had been no press conference, no public ceremony. His reward was a quiet, "good job" from his captain and a mountain of follow-up paperwork. He didn't mind. He wasn't in it for the glory. He walked over to a small bookshelf and picked up a faded photograph of a smiling man in a police uniform from 2 decades ago. It was his father. His motivation was deeply personal. His father had been a decorated officer who was forced into early retirement after being severely injured during a robbery. He had spent David's teenage years in chronic pain, but he never once expressed regret for his career choice. He had taught his son that service was the highest calling, that protecting others was a noble purpose that gave a life meaning far beyond any paycheck. David had joined the force not to be a hero, but to honor his father's legacy, to carry on a tradition of quiet, steadfast duty. That was his why. He found himself thinking about the strange heiress again. Her offer of a donation, while clumsy and misguided, was perhaps not malicious. It was simply the only way she knew how to operate. He thought about the raw confession in her eyes, the admission of her own emptiness. It was a level of vulnerability he had never seen from someone in her position. He was still cautious, but a sliver of empathy had begun to work its way through his professional skepticism. Perhaps she wasn't just a bored rich girl after all. Perhaps she was just lost. Victoria's research led her to discover a community outreach program. The BAPD was involved with the Cops and Kids event at a youth center in a less affluent part of the city. A brief notice on the department's website mentioned that officers volunteered on their days off to mentor at-risk youth. The event was that Saturday. She saw Officer Miller's name on a list of volunteers. A new plan began to form in her mind, one that had nothing to do with money or grand gestures. It was a chance to see him in his world, on his terms. On Saturday morning, she drove to the youth center. It was a humble, vibrant building, its walls covered in colorful murals. It was a world away from the manicured sterility of Beverly Hills. Victoria had traded her couture for a simple pair of jeans and a plain t-shirt, but she still felt conspicuously out of place. The sounds of children laughing and shouting filled the air, a chaotic and joyful noise that was entirely foreign to her. For a moment, she almost lost her nerve, feeling like an intruder in this place of genuine community. She saw him almost immediately. He was not in uniform. He was wearing a simple polo shirt and jeans, and he was sitting at a table with a group of young teenagers, helping them assemble a model rocket. He was smiling, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his weary face. He listened patiently to the kids, showing them how the pieces fit together, his voice full of encouragement. In this context, he was not Officer Miller, the stoic public servant. He was just David, a kind and patient man giving his time to make a small difference. For a long time, she simply watched from a distance, hidden behind a support pillar. She saw a side of him that she could never have imagined. She saw his quiet strength not as a professional shield, but as a source of comfort for others. She saw the respect and admiration in the eyes of the teenagers he was helping. He wasn't performing for an audience. He was simply being himself. And that self was a man of deep character and integrity. Everything she had first thought about him was wrong, a projection of her own prejudices. Finally, she took a deep breath and stepped out from her hiding spot. She walked over to one of the event organizers and quietly volunteered to help serve lunch. She didn't announce herself or try to draw attention. She simply put on an apron and began placing sandwiches and juice boxes onto paper plates, her movements clumsy but sincere. She was determined to contribute, not with her money, but with her effort, however small. It was a foreign and humbling experience. He noticed her eventually. His eyes widened in surprise when he saw her there, serving food with a focused determination. He walked over, a look of cautious curiosity on his face. "Miss Sterling," he said, his voice quiet. "What are you doing here?" She didn't look up from her task. "My name is Victoria," she said softly, "and I'm here because I wanted to see what real value looks like." I wanted to understand. There was no artifice in her voice, only a simple, humble truth. They worked side by side for the next hour, the noise of the community center providing a cover for their quiet conversation. It flowed more easily this time, free from the tension of their previous encounters. She asked him why he volunteered his time here. He hesitated for a moment, and then he told her about his father, about his injury, and about the legacy of service he felt compelled to honor. He spoke of his belief that connecting with the community, especially with kids, was the most important part of the job. As he shared his story, a profound sense of understanding washed over Victoria. She finally grasped the source of his quiet dignity. It was not born of arrogance or professional detachment, but of a deep and abiding sense of purpose. His life was built on a foundation of duty and sacrifice, values that were entirely alien to her own upbringing. She saw the immense richness in his life, a wealth that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with character. The vulnerability he showed her unlocked her own. In that noisy, humble youth center, surrounded by strangers, she finally confessed the full extent of her own spiritual poverty. "I have everything a person could ever want," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she looked at him. "A limitless bank account, houses, cars, influence. But I stand for nothing. My life doesn't mean anything. It's just a collection of expensive things." The confession was a quiet surrender, an admission of a truth she had been running from her entire life. In that moment, the final barrier between them dissolved. He was no longer a cop, and she was no longer an heiress. They were just two people from vastly different worlds, connecting on a fundamental human level. He looked at her, not with pity, but with a deep, compassionate understanding. He saw her not as a problem to be solved or a nuisance to be dismissed, but as a person searching for meaning. "It's never too late to build a foundation," he said quietly, his words offering not a solution, but a sliver of hope. The air between them was no longer filled with awkwardness or suspicion. It was filled with a nascent, unspoken respect. He respected her for having the courage to confront her own emptiness, and she respected him for the profound integrity that defined his existence. They were from two different planets, yet they had found a common ground in shared vulnerability and the universal human search for purpose. As the event wound down and people began to leave, they stood in a comfortable silence for a moment. "Thank you, David," she said, using his first name for the first time, "for showing me this." He simply nodded, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. "You did the work, Victoria." They parted ways not with a formal handshake, but with a shared look of mutual understanding that was more meaningful than any physical gesture. A powerful and unexpected bond had been forged, setting the stage for the profound changes that were yet to come. Weeks later, the city decided to formally honor its unassuming hero. In a sun-dappled Beverly Hills park, a small stage was erected, adorned with the city's seal and flanked by American flags that snapped in the gentle breeze. The atmosphere was one of sincere community gratitude, a stark contrast to the performative high society galas Victoria was accustomed to. Here, the crowd consisted of local residents in casual attire, city officials looking earnestly approachable, and a proud contingent of police officers in their dress uniforms. It was an event born not from a need for publicity, but from a genuine desire to recognize a man who had made their pristine world a little safer. The air hummed with polite chatter and the distant laughter of children playing on a nearby lawn. Victoria arrived alone, parking her car several blocks away to avoid drawing attention. She wore an elegant but understated navy blue dress, her hair pulled back simply, her makeup minimal. There was nothing about her appearance that screamed heiress. She deliberately positioned herself at the very edge of the assembled crowd, partially shaded by the broad leaves of a magnolia tree. Her posture was one of humility and observation. She was not here to be seen, but to bear witness. She watched the proceedings with a quiet intensity, feeling like a foreigner who had finally learned the language of the land she was visiting. Her world and this one had finally, impossibly, overlapped. When Officer David Miller was called to the stage, he moved with a reluctant stiffness, his formal dress uniform looking sharp but unfamiliar on his shoulders. The spotlight was clearly an uncomfortable place for him, and he kept his eyes fixed on a point just above the crowd, as if to distance himself from the adulation. Victoria saw in his posture the same humility she had witnessed at the youth center, the inherent discomfort of a man of action being celebrated for simply doing what he believed was right. He stood beside the mayor, a quiet and steady presence amidst a ceremony that was fundamentally at odds with his unassuming nature. The mayor of Beverly Hills spoke first, his voice booming with practiced political warmth. He lauded David's sharp instincts and unwavering dedication, Then the police chief took the podium, a man with a weathered face and a gaze that commanded respect. He spoke of integrity, of the quiet, often thankless work that is the true foundation of law enforcement. Officer Miller didn't just see a suspicious vehicle, the chief declared. He saw a tear in the fabric of our community's safety, and he pulled the thread until the entire criminal enterprise unraveled. Every word of praise was a sharp, painful, yet clarifying echo in Victoria's mind, reinforcing the profound truth she had come to understand about him. As the speeches continued, Victoria found herself lost in a moment of deep internal reflection. The memory of her voice, sharp and mocking as it carried from her terrace, played in her mind. The shame was still there, a hot ember in her gut, but it was no longer just a source of self-loathing. It had become a landmark, a fixed point in her life from which she could measure her own transformation. She was no longer that person, the one who equated a man's worth with his visibility or his salary. That woman felt like a stranger to her now, a ghost from a past life she was determined to leave behind. The climax of the ceremony arrived as the police chief presented David with a polished wooden plaque, its engraved gold plate gleaming in the afternoon sun. It was the department's award for exceptional service. The crowd erupted in a warm and sustained round of applause. David accepted the award with a brief, humble nod, his lips curling into the faintest of smiles. He held the plaque as if it were a heavy, unfamiliar object. Victoria watched his hands, the steady, capable hands of a man who is far more comfortable gripping a steering wheel or helping a child with a model rocket than holding a trophy. Prompted by the chief to say a few words, David stepped reluctantly to the microphone. The crowd quieted in anticipation. "Thank you, Chief, Mr. Mayor," he began, his voice clear but unadorned. "I appreciate this. I truly do. But the truth is, any officer in our department would have done the same thing. I was just the one who was there." He paused, looking out at his colleagues in the crowd. "I was just doing my job. Thank you." And with that, he stepped back. The speech was barely 30 seconds long, yet its simple sincerity resonated more powerfully than all the eloquent praise that had preceded it. With the formal ceremony concluded, the crowd broke apart, and a line quickly formed as residents and officials moved to congratulate David personally. He shook hands, accepted pats on the back, and listened patiently to words of thanks, his discomfort with the attention palpable. He was polite and gracious, but his eyes held a look of a man longing for escape. Victoria saw her opportunity. This was the moment. The public praise was finished. What needed to be said now was private, a final, necessary closing of a circle that had begun with a cruel joke. She took a deep, steadying breath and began to weave her way through the dispersing crowd. Each step was deliberate, a conscious movement away from her old life and towards this new, uncertain sense of self. The fear and insecurity that had plagued her during their first encounters were gone, replaced by a quiet, clear-eyed purpose. She was no longer approaching him to assuage her guilt, but to express a truth that had fundamentally reshaped her. She felt the weight of her past actions, but also the lightness of her newfound clarity. Suddenly, a familiar, sharp voice cut through the air. "Victoria, darling, don't tell me you're actually fawning over the help." It was one of the women from her terrace, her face a perfect mask of condescending amusement. In the past, such a comment would have triggered a defensive, witty retort or a wave of social anxiety. But now, Victoria didn't even break her stride. She offered the woman no glance, no acknowledgement whatsoever. The comment, and the entire shallow world it represented, simply washed over her, utterly powerless to affect her course. She had a more important destination. She finally reached him as the last well-wisher was walking away. "David," she said, her voice soft but clear enough to cut through the park's ambient noise. He turned, and a look of genuine surprise flickered across his face. He hadn't expected to see her here. For a moment, they just stood there, the noise of the world seeming to fade into a distant hum, creating an intimate pocket of silence just for them. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of curiosity and the same cautious reserve she now understood was part of his nature. This was it. The apology she had rehearsed in her mind felt inadequate, So she spoke from the heart, letting her usual composure fall away completely. "I know I apologized before," she began, her voice trembling almost imperceptibly, "but I need to do it properly. That day in the parking lot, I was just sorry for being cruel. I was ashamed of what I'd said, of how I had acted." She held his gaze, willing him to see the profound difference in her intention now, to understand that this was something more than a simple expression of regret. She took another breath, steadying herself before laying her soul bare. "But that's not the whole truth," she continued, her voice dropping to an almost whisper, raw with vulnerability. "I didn't just laugh at you, David. I laughed because I didn't understand. I didn't understand what real value was. A single tear threatened to escape, but she held it back. You have a purpose. You protect people. You contribute something real to the world. And me? I just exist. I just consume." The final piece of her confession came in a rush of emotion, the most honest words she had ever spoken. "Your actions that day, they didn't just uncover a criminal ring. For me, they uncovered everything. You showed me, without even trying, how completely and utterly empty my life is." She finally looked down, unable to hold his gaze any longer. "And for that, I'm not just sorry. I'm grateful. You changed my life, and you don't even know it." In that moment of profound vulnerability, David saw her. He saw past the sterling name, the billion-dollar fortune, and the intimidating facade of the socialite. He saw a woman who had undertaken the terrifying journey of self-examination and had emerged on the other side, humbled and irrevocably changed. Her confession was not a plea for forgiveness, but a statement of fact, a gift of raw, unvarnished truth. The last of his skepticism dissolved, replaced by a deep and powerful wave of empathy. He saw her pain, and he respected her courage. He was silent for a long moment, and then he gave her a small, sad smile. "My father," he began, his voice quiet and gentle. "He used to say this uniform wasn't a symbol of power. He said it was a symbol of trust people place in you. The heaviest thing an officer carries isn't the gear. It's the weight of that trust." He looked at her, his eyes full of a quiet grace. "It sounds like you're finally starting to understand what that weight feels like. The weight of purpose." He had accepted her apology not with words, but by sharing a piece of his own soul, a piece of his father's legacy. That quiet exchange of vulnerability was the final transformative act. It was no longer about a rich woman and a working-class cop, or about an apology and its acceptance. It was a moment of pure human connection, a recognition of two people who, despite their vastly different lives, understood the universal search for meaning. The social barriers that had once seemed like insurmountable walls had crumbled into dust, leaving behind a foundation of profound and mutual respect. A genuine, unguarded smile passed between them, sealing an unspoken and powerful bond. The encounter in the park was not an ending, but a beginning. The profound sense of gratitude Victoria felt did not dissipate. Instead, it crystallized into an unwavering sense of purpose. For the first time in her life, she had a direction, a why that was not tied to her family name or her bank account. She spent the following weeks in a fever of activity, but it was not the frivolous busyness of her past. She locked herself in her home office, foregoing parties and social engagements to immerse herself in research. She consulted with criminologists, sociologists, and retired police chiefs, learning everything she could about the complex relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Her wealth was no longer a means for indulgence, but a powerful tool waiting to be deployed for a meaningful cause. Armed with a meticulously crafted 100-page proposal, she arranged a meeting with David. They met at a simple, quiet coffee shop, a neutral ground far from both her mansion and his precinct. She didn't offer a vague promise of a donation this time. Instead, she laid out a clear, actionable vision, the Miller Foundation for Community Trust. She detailed its mission, its proposed structure, and its initial funding, which she would provide entirely from her personal fortune, a sum of $50 million to start. Then, she slid a page across the table. It was an offer for him to sit on the board as its primary advisor. "Your expertise and integrity are the foundation's most valuable assets," she told him. Without you, it's just my money. With you, it can create real change." David was stunned into silence. He read through the proposal, his initial skepticism battling with the sheer thoroughness and sincerity of her plan. He was a street cop, not a philanthropist or a board member. He was deeply wary of the publicity and the unfamiliar world of non-profits, a world he instinctively distrusted. But as he looked at Victoria, he saw no trace of the bored socialite seeking a new hobby. He saw a woman who had poured her soul into this project, who had done the hard work, and was not asking for his name as a trophy, but for his guidance as a partner. He saw the potential to effect change on a scale he had never imagined. After a long, thoughtful silence, he looked at her and gave a single, firm nod. "I'm in," he said. The months that followed were a blur of intense, gratifying work. Victoria transformed. The woman who once filled her days with shopping and brunches was now chairing board meetings, negotiating with tech developers to create cutting-edge de-escalation training simulations, and meeting with community leaders in church basements. She was tireless, driven, and brilliant, applying the sharp intellect she had once wasted on social strategy to a cause that truly mattered. She traded her couture dresses for business suits, her champagne for black coffee, and her boredom for a profound sense of fulfillment. The emptiness that had haunted her for so long was gone, filled by the solid, satisfying weight of meaningful labor. The Miller Foundation's mission was built on the two pillars of David's own character, his professional skill and his compassionate heart. The first branch was dedicated to providing law enforcement agencies with advanced technology and training, focusing on the kind of nuanced, instinct-driven police work he had exemplified. It funded scholarships for officers to pursue higher education in fields like psychology and sociology. The second, equally important branch, focused on building bridges. It provided grants for community-based programs that fostered positive, non-enforcement interactions between officers and the neighborhoods they served, just like the youth center that had been the site of their own connection. The Foundation's launch was not a glitzy gala held in a ballroom. Instead, Victoria chose the auditorium of that very same community youth center. The room was filled not with socialites, but with journalists, community activists, police officers of all ranks, and the families who lived in the neighborhood. When Victoria stepped to the podium, she was poised and confident, but her voice was filled with a humility that was entirely new. She spoke of her own journey, of her past ignorance and prejudice, and of how one man's quiet integrity had opened her eyes. It was not a speech about charity. It was a testament to the transformative power of seeing the humanity in others. As she spoke, it was clear to everyone in the room that they were witnessing the debut of a completely new woman. She was no longer Victoria Sterling, the heiress. She was Victoria Sterling, the advocate, the founder, the passionate agent of change. A fire burned in her eyes that had never been there before, the fire of purpose. Her wealth, once a gilded cage, had been reforged into a key, unlocking potential not just for herself, but for countless others. She had discovered that her great privilege was not something to be enjoyed, but something to be leveraged for the greater good. David sat in the front row, not in uniform, but in a simple suit. He was no longer just a patrol officer. He was a respected advisor, a voice of authenticity and experience guiding an organization that bore his name. He watched Victoria command the stage, not with arrogance, but with a quiet, powerful authority born of conviction. A sense of profound pride washed over him. Their lives, once separated by an impossible gulf of class and experience, were now inextricably linked in a shared and noble mission. They were partners, their bond forged not in romance, but in a deep, abiding mutual respect. In her closing remarks, Victoria announced the Foundation's first official grant, a $1 million endowment to this very youth center, ensuring its future for decades to come. The announcement was met with a stunned silence, followed by a thunderous, emotional standing ovation. The story had come full circle. The place where she had first witnessed David's true character was now the first beneficiary of the legacy he had inspired. The resolution was not just a promise. It was a concrete, tangible action, a down payment on a hopeful future. Their journey was a powerful testament to the idea that true wealth is never measured by what you accumulate for yourself, but by what you contribute to the lives of others. Victoria learned that purpose isn't found in luxury, but in service, and David discovered that his quiet dedication could inspire change far beyond his daily patrol route. Their intertwined lives became a beacon of hope, proving that bridges can be built across any divide when people have the courage to look past their own worlds and truly see the value in one another. Have you ever misjudged someone completely, only to realize their true worth later? Leave a little heart if you believe love is more powerful than any wealth. Subscribe for more second chance stories. Comment love is priceless if you also believe in human kindness.